Chapter 14. A Weird Story. Mrs. Carrier, still angry over the blotted-out faces of her relatives, said bitterly, "I think such destruction is unforgivable. This is Raleigh's home, to be sure, but there are certain things that go beyond all reason." She went on, "If my brother Raleigh isn't found soon, I declare I'm going to have this whole bookcase torn down. Then we can get at those pictures. I hope that whatever paint was used to cover the faces can be removed easily." Nancy put an arm around the irate woman. "I'm sure the pictures can be restored," she said. "Art shops do wonderful things these days." Thinking it might calm Mrs. Carrier to get away from the bookcase, she said, "My dad didn't have much time to see the house on his first visit. Wouldn't you like to show him around? I'll go with you." The three toured both floors, while Bess and George continued to work on the bookcase. Mr. Drew studied the unusual designs in the carved woodwork. By the time they returned to the first floor, Mrs. Carrier seemed to be her usual self. She even laughed and said cheerily, "Mr. Drew, tell me, have you ever heard of such a crazy place?" The lawyer smiled. "I can't say I have. I imagine, though, that your brother had a lot of fun building this house. It's amazing to me why he never invited any relatives here. Surely they would have been highly entertained." Mrs. Carrier said she could not understand this either. As far as we know now, his only companion was a robot. "I would prefer a human servant at any time," Mr. Drew remarked. Just then Bess called excitedly, "Everybody come here at once! Quick!" The three hurried to the living room. Bess and George were poring over a volume they had found in the bookcase. Nancy asked what the title was, and George replied, "It's called Archaeological Finds in Jewelry. Take a look at this page." The open book revealed the picture of a gold bracelet made of intertwined serpents. Each one had a ruby eye, and the jewel piece was encrusted with turquoise. Nancy noticed that the page had been marked in ink with a large asterisk. Bess cried out, "This must be the skeleton's bracelet! Here it says the ancient bracelet was found on the bony arm of an unknown Aztec woman's skeleton." George began to read the text aloud. "Mystery shrouds the identity of the woman who wore the bracelet. During a dig in a lonely area far away from cities, the skeleton was found intact. It is thought that the woman died from the venom of a poisonous snake. Whether the bracelet was hers or was put on after her death is not known." "Listen to this!" Bess burst out as George paused. "It says here that the skeleton and the bracelet disappeared mysteriously from the dig. The thief probably sold them, but there is no record as to where they went." The girls looked at one another. Each was thinking the same thing. Had Raleigh Banister purchased the skeleton and bracelet from the thief? In deference to Mrs. Carrier, they did not express the thought aloud. "You won't mind if I go outdoors for a little while?" she asked. "This place is making me nervous. Some fresh air will do me good." Mr. Drew asked if she would like to go home, but Mrs. Carrier insisted that he and the girls go on with their investigation. "I'll feel better in a little while," she assured them. As soon as she had gone outside, the others discussed the anonymous note Nancy had received and its relation to the story in the book. "One thing is sure," said George. "Somebody who knows about the bracelet hasn't found it yet. He wants Nancy to do this for him." "You could be right," Mr. Drew replied. "Then, after Nancy finds the bracelet, he'll try to steal it." Bess asked, "Do you think the writer of the note knows the bracelet is here? Has he been trying to locate it, but failed?" The others shrugged, and George said, "Anything's possible." Nancy reminded her friends that unless they started a search for the bracelet, none of them would ever find it. "I think the location of this book in the shelves may be a clue. Where was it?" she asked. Bess pointed to a space between the other volumes. Nancy quickly took out the books near that spot, then examined the rear wooden panel. There was no sign of another opening or any hidden contrivance. "I suggest," said Mr. Drew, "that we take every book out of the case. We might be able to discover some way to make the piece revolve again." The books were removed an armful at a time and put in consecutive piles so they could be correctly restored to their original positions. The eyes of the three girls and Mr. Drew swept over the entire surface of the backing from ceiling to floor. Finally, Nancy remarked, "I guess the sliding secret panel is the only way to make this thing revolve." Again, she put her hand into the opening and felt all around the weights. Her fingers touched a small lever. The instant she moved it, the sliding panel slammed shut onto her wrist. "Ouch!" she cried out, and tried with her other hand to pull the panel back. It would not give an inch. The next second, the bookcase began to revolve. Nancy tried frantically to release her injured hand. "Help!" she cried. Mr. Drew jumped forward. Calling to Bess and George to help him, he held on to the bookcase. With their combined strength, they managed to keep it from revolving farther. Nancy's hand was numb by this time. Desperately, she tried to find some mechanism so she could free herself. "It's no use," Nancy thought. But the determined girl grit her teeth and said aloud, "Somebody hand me a heavy book." Bess picked one up. Nancy took it in her left hand and swung the volume with all her might against the sliding panel. The wood shivered, but did not give way. She gave it another hard whack. This time there was a splintering sound, and a piece of the panel fell down behind the partition. Quickly, Nancy pulled out her hand. Mr. Drew and the girls let go of the bookcase, which once more began to revolve. They heaved sighs of relief. "You had a narrow escape," Bess said sympathetically. "Your whole hand might have been ripped off." "Yes, I know," said Nancy. "Thank you all for helping me. I think I'll go and run cold water over my wrist and hand." She went into the kitchen. Circulation was soon restored, and she returned to the living room. By this time, Mrs. Carrier had come inside. She was listening to Bess's graphic description of what had happened. "This place is just too dangerous for you girls to work in," she said dismally. Nancy tried to cheer up the woman. "We're going to solve this mystery soon, I'm sure of it. Please don't worry." She noticed that the bookcase had swung around to the portrait side. Her father had jammed a wedge into one side so the mechanism could not work. "I think we should examine each of these pictures," he said. "One or more of them may contain a clue." He lifted down 5 of the portraits and handed one to each person in the room. There was complete quiet for a few minutes as they all scanned the pictures carefully. Suddenly, Mrs. Carrier cried out, "This face! There's money under the black paint." She started chipping off the black coating with her fingernails. The others crowded around to watch. 2 minutes later, Mrs. Carrier pulled her hand away from the portrait, grabbed her fingers, and cried out in pain. End of chapter 14.